Hello, everyone, and welcome to our special uh, presentation here for Activist Appreciation Month. My name is Lisa Levinson, and I am the Campaigns Director for In Defense of Animals, and I'm thrilled to share this special presentation with you today in honor of Activist Appreciation Month with Dr. Roshni Ladny. She is a researcher who has put together some very key data and for the United Nations, and we're so glad to have her here today. Hi, Roshni, how are you doing?
I am doing well. Thank you, Lisa. Thank you, Mary.
Thanks for joining us. And we also have Mary Easonsey here. She's with our development team. Hi, Mary, how are
Hey,
you?
everybody. Thanks for being here.
So Mary will be answering some of our questions in the chat box. Feel free to ask questions there or in the Q&A section of the webinar. And we will have opportunity to answer your questions towards the end of the presentation. First, we're going to begin with Dr. Roshni Ladny. She's going to share a bit about herself and then more about research and her connection to this important topic of trauma exposure due to animal cruelty.
Yes, first, hi. I'm just humbled to be here, and I'm grateful to be here to share the work that I and many of my colleagues across the globe have been working on today. And thank you so much to you, Lisa and Mary, and everything you guys do to support animals across the globe and consequently humanity and society. So thank you for having me. And it's wow, so amazing to see everybody just from across the planet here today. And so I will just do a brief introduction of myself, my educational background, my advocacy background, just so you understand how all the pieces I discussed today connect together. So, like many of you, I too probably had a very deep connection for the natural world around me growing up. The intricate connection humans can have with animals. I'm one of those people, and I'm not ashamed to say that if I see a bug die unnecessarily, I cry, I tear up for it. And I think that's a good thing because I think that means that we have a respect for all types of life and a respect for sentience. And so I think that combined with some very unfortunate childhood experiences in general segued my research into understanding why people do the bad things they do to other people and to animals. And so my educational background is a reflection of all of those experiences growing up. And so I got my bachelor's degree in chemistry and psychology. And then I wanted to study more about human behavior. And so I got my master's in clinical psychology. Then I did another master's in criminology and decided that that is where I belong. And so I got my doctorate in criminology and criminal justice in 2018. And through that, I have been able to combine my background and knowledge set from clinical psychology, the biological sciences, to understand how violent experiences and trauma impact children who are growing up. And so I will start off by going ahead and sharing my just the beginning of the. Let's see, one second. Whoops, whoops. Uh, okay. So, what I'm going to start off by doing is kind of connecting these pieces in my life together. So, you'll see that my empathy and compassion has basically inspired all of the things that I do related to not just helping children and animals, but in turn trying to make some positive impact on society. And so, my research focuses mainly on the development of children when they grow up in adverse environments. So this would include experiencing child abuse, sexual abuse, physical abuse, having incarcerated parents. And of a recent interest over the past probably 8 years of or so has been what happens when children are exposed to violence against animals. So before I actually discuss that international research, I'll explain to you my on-the-ground background. So doing actual animal cruelty work with a rural humane society in Florida. And so I was a volunteer, long-term volunteer for that humane society. And so I'll talk about that and then segue into the research on the animal welfare and child welfare from an international perspective. And this right here is my heart dog, TC Provo. He was my first dog. I was not really allowed to have dogs growing up as a kid. And so TC Provo, and he was obviously a rescue. So he is also an inspiration to me. So, as a longtime volunteer, community outreach coordinator with Gadsden County Humane Society, so this is in Gadsden County, Florida. It's a rural area. There's not a lot of funding. I was involved with doing on-the-ground animal rescue. So we had a lot of abandonment and neglect of dogs, cats, farm pigs, especially hunting dogs. And so I encountered dog fighting cases, severe animal cruelty, and then most often it was neglect. And so we developed a program where I volunteered to help do the best I could in assisting families with caring for the pets they already have. So this included building fencing and housing for outdoor dogs who were chained up. Um, Unfortunately, in Gadsden County, there's still no tethering policy. So animals are often on very short chains. And we would provide veterinary care, so spay and neuter, and then also humane education, which is very, very important. Sometimes social norms and learned behaviors are really hard to change in one generation, but they're easier instilled, and those behaviors and those value systems are easier taught in the younger generation. And so we did some humane education presentations to the community, but also importantly to elementary schools, where we got to talk about empathy, animals, and welfare, animal welfare with the children. Following a few years, so this was back in 2012, 2013. Following that, so maybe around 2016, we had been trying to network with the Gadsden County Sheriff's Office to see if they could take over the animal control facility that was there, because it was not an actual shelter. And so through that networking, the sheriff there graciously granted me, I guess, a volunteer special deputy status, which allowed me to work a little bit alongside some of the deputies. So when we encountered cases of animal cruelty, especially dog fighting, we could call them up. I did trainings for some of the deputies on the link between commission of animal cruelty and commission of violence against humans. And when I was on some of those cases, and this will probably come as no surprise to you guys, there was a link. This link here between animal abuse and child maltreatment is something I think that everybody knows, whether they study this professionally or not. So I would encounter cases of child maltreatment, so neglect. There was times I remember seeing kids with just bruises all over them, and so I would have to contact DCF, file a report. And it brought me back to my days when I worked as a clinical mental health therapist. So it brought back all that experience working with traumatized children. And helping the animals was certainly no escape from that. So it was abuse and neglect all around. The animal control facility there, it was only a holding facility, very poorly run. There was a lot of challenges with enforcing the policies. So sometimes, as you'll see, policies are there, they're on book, but they're not translated properly or they're not enforced properly. So I remember those days, trying to find a place to house 8 hunting dogs that were starving and abandoned. One had the chain in their neck. We encountered that a lot out there. And so it was very hard to do this with very limited resources and no official support from authority figures behind our back. So we didn't have that support from animal control. So that was actually a very traumatizing experience. There were many animals we could save, and then some we could not, and I still remember who they are. And I try to focus on the ones that we could save. So here are some of them. Like, this is Raven. He has since passed, but we were able to build dog fences. So these may not look like much. I know when you see them, you're like, oh, they're still outside. They're still fenced. These are old dog houses. But you have to understand the conditions that many of these animals were in and the lack of policy that, giving them food bowls, putting this here, building a fence back here. I don't know if you could see it. It was something they had until we could them better homes. or keep working to change policy. And so you can see these are the dogs very happy with their new fences. And this is Mike. And this is my rescue Bailey, who I got from the animal shelter. He was set, or the animal control facility. He was set to be euthanized that morning, and we had just gotten back. So he's got a rescue story for another day, and he is still here. So these are just a few of the pictures I wanted to share so you can see who are the beautiful sentient creatures who have inspired me to actually do the research to advance policy. And so this is Dear Rockwell, also known as the Rockster, aka Rock Star. And this was him when I found him. He had a degenerative disc disease, could not walk. He dragged himself around. This was his setup, and he was on a chain. He was at the end of his life, about 10 or 11. So we rescued him. He stayed with me for about a few months, and then we found a wonderful woman who had a whole setup, Jules, actually, and she's from the UK, but she was in Florida, where I live. She had a wonderful setup for many dogs that had a lot of physical health problems. And you can see them here both in their cart. And over here is Rockwell. He shops clearance like I do. So this was around Christmas time. And this just shows you that behind the research I'm going to talk about, there's a lot of clinical terms, a lot of different psychological processes, a lot of hard work, but at the core of this is my experience with suffering and not wanting them to suffer anymore. And this goes for animals and children. I can't share any of the images of children I worked with, due to privacy laws. But seeing that neglect here does remind me of the neglect and the abuse I witnessed in children when I worked as a crisis therapist. So now that I've explained my on the ground, I guess I like to call it, animal activism, I'd like to transition into the research aspect of what I do now. So I do have that background in clinical psychology. And so, like I said, I've always studied the psychological impacts of child maltreatment, childhood exposure to violence, what it does to the mind and what it does to the physical body, so the brain. And this led me to volunteer with an organization known as the European Link Coalition, soon to be the World Link Coalition. It's called the European Link Coalition because of where the first research studies on the exposure of animal cruelty were conducted. And so I'm going to talk about that. Our founder, Mal Plant, has been instrumental in this. And so I've worked as a volunteer alongside him for probably the past 9 years. And one thing that struck a chord with us is the endemic animal cruelty that we see across the globe. So often we hear about the link between committing animal cruelty and a future likelihood of committing violence against people. But it's not often that we trace that initial factor back further. So what predicts children who commit cruelty to animals? Well, obviously, there has to be an exposure component, as we know from social learning theory. There's many other factors, but we realized there was very limited research on the consequences of childhood exposure to what we call normalized violence against animals or mass violence against animals. So where killings of animals happen on a daily basis and children are confronted with it. So just to give you a peek of what we're going to talk about related to this, this is the policy that we helped contribute to, General Comment 26, which is through the United Nations Committee on the Rights of the Child. So as part of their convention on the rights of the child, they issued General Comment 26 in 2023. And it included protection of animals, albeit a very small statement. But I do think that there's a lot of good that could come from this. And so this is an important quote here from the High Commissioner of Human Rights. In relation to GC 26, there's an accountability on government and business. All states are to implement committee recommendations as quickly as possible. The most disadvantaged children are impacted the most. And this statement here is going to be reflected in the research that I discussed today. So before I go into some of the evidence we've seen, the actual neurological processes that happen in a child when they're exposed to animal cruelty, I'll give you a little bit of history about GC 26. Mal and I and other wonderful volunteers were comprised of human rights attorneys, animal welfare advocates, child developmental experts, researchers, and we gathered together the academic research on the link between childhood exposure to animal cruelty and subsequent harms in children. And we started presenting those to the United Nations Committee on the Rights of the Child. Now, GC26 is essentially a sustainability general comment. It's about the rights of the child, the environment, and there's a special focus on climate change. So you might be wondering, well, what does animal cruelty have to do with the rights of the child, the environment, and climate change? Well, we're going to talk about that. But before I do that, this is the inclusion of the statement now in this international treaty. Based on the research we were able to share and the video footage we were able to show the committee members, GC26 in paragraph 26 now includes this statement. Children must be protected from physical and psychological violence, such as domestic violence, or violence inflicted on animals. And this is huge. The Convention on the Rights of the Child is probably the most ratified treaty in the world. It's ratified by all countries, unfortunately, excluding the US. Paragraph 23 also addresses the animal world. The developmental benefits to children of a healthy environment include those linked to opportunities to experience outdoor activities and to interact with and play in natural environments. And this important statement here, including the animal world. So this draws out the part of the natural environment where wildlife lives. And so there's a lot of interconnection among these key pieces. And interestingly enough, before GC 26 came out with these specific paragraphs, Article 19 already stated that children had a right to freedom from all forms of violence. And when you think of all forms of violence, exposure to violence against animals falls under that. Even indirect exposure to violence, which we'll talk about, can constitute a psychological violence against the child. And so, along with GC 26 and the research we presented, the UN committee issued some concluding observations. So these are three of the countries that concluding observations included some component of protecting children from animal cruelty. The first one was issued to Tunisia, and this was before GC 26. And this concerned the mass shooting of dogs. And then you also had the reporting of Azerbaijan, and the UN committee also condemned the mass shootings of dogs there. So this happened after we presented all the research. Then you have the development of GC 26. And then after that, the first concluding observation after GC 26 to address the protection of animals was for South Africa, and it pertains specifically to trophy hunting. Now, I would like to emphasize, I'll keep this here actually, I'd like to emphasize a point. No country or culture is immune from animal cruelty. As you know, we sometimes have a lot of cognitive dissonance that occurs as to why we sometimes protect certain animals, but we allow the slaughter of other animals. Countries have their own practices. No Western country, Eastern country, anything between is immune from this. So the countries we discussed today are simply there because this is where some of the policies have been implemented, and this is where some of the specific types of animal cruelty that we're examining occur. On top of that, some of the countries we're talking about today are the countries in which citizens have sent their desperate pleas to the European Link Coalition and all of us involved in it, begging for some sort of guidance and some sort of help. So we have gotten the video footage and the child testimonies from those countries. So before we go further into that, it's important to understand the framework of animal cruelty research. So many people are familiar with the statistic that serial killers are more likely to have had a history of commission of animal cruelty in their childhood, and that is very true. But it's a lot more complex than that. We know that committing animal cruelty in childhood is a statistically significant and substantive significant predictor of not only committing violence against humans, but also having a lot of maladaptive behaviors. So it's usually a risk factor when we see that a child, like if a child comes to me in a therapy program and I see that they have a history of committing animal cruelty, especially proactive animal cruelty. So that's the type of violence where it's intentional and the goal is to cause harm. Reactive cruelty, reactive violence against animals is also very harmful. But what really, is a triggering factor for a psychotherapist is that proactive violence. And so we already know this research. We know that, individuals who commit animal cruelty in childhood have an almost 10 times greater likelihood of committing a sexually violent crime when they grow older. Individuals who commit domestic violence are significantly more likely to commit violence against against animals. They're all interconnected. But for the past few decades, this is where the research has stayed. The link between commission of animal cruelty and then how it links to violence against humans. So we traced it back and we said, well, surely there must be studies that look at what predicts that animal cruelty commission, what starts at the very beginning. So, of course, there's risk factors like childhood trauma, so experiencing maltreatment in the home. There's also neurophysiological developmental factors. So, brain developmental issues in early infancy, brain injury, those types of factors. But one thing that started to emerge in the few studies that had examined this was the instigating factor of childhood exposure to violence against animals. And we saw that this happened before commission of animal cruelty. And this was an independent predictor of committing animal cruelty. It was also an independent predictor of committing violence against humans. And it was also a predictor of empathy erosion, so decrease in empathy. And for some children, it was a predictor of what we call internalizing and externalizing symptoms. So this would include things like post-traumatic stress symptoms, nightmares, depression, self-harm, suicidality. Okay. And so this is the research that I'll be talking about today. This is another important domain of animal cruelty research that I've been working on. So it's viewing violence against animals as a public health issue and environmental problem. So not to pinpoint fingers of any country or any type of, business that relies on animal products, but we do know that the large scale factory farms are very, very notorious for polluting the environments around them. Animal cruelty, even though there's supposed to be certain laws and procedures to minimize harm to sentient creatures, we do know that oftentimes those policies are not followed through for one reason or the other, and animals do suffer. And so there's a link between how we treat animals and how it impacts the environment. So the spread of bird flu, the spread of mad cow disease, things of that sort. So it's all interconnected. And so, as we know, nothing happens in isolation. And what we have seen so far from the studies we have conducted on our own and the limited studies we have reviewed is that the commission of animal cruelty is a strong statistical predictor of violence against humans. So one way to look at this, and this is something we've actually presented to policymaking officials to kind of get them to see the whole picture, is that we have to think about, well, what are the actual costs of violence? If there are 100 different factors, and that's an underestimate, but if there are 100 different factors that predict violent behavior, if you could tackle one of those factors, how would it reduce the costs of violence? Because the costs of violent crime is immense. So data was analyzed from 163 countries using the UN Survey of Crime Trend and Operations of the criminal justice system. So it's a very valid, large-scale data set. And what they found from these 163 countries was that in 1 year, the cost of violence was $14.8 trillion. $14.8 trillion. And that is due to many of these indirect and direct costs, court costs for prosecution, mental health costs for victims, long-term costs in terms of physical health care, security costs. So all of this is interconnected, and many of these costs are intangible. You can't really put a price point on that. So this brings me now to domain two, because that's what we're going to be focusing on here. And I'm viewing this as if we can tackle one of those many factors that contribute to violence, I imagine what kind of difference would that make in not just the monetary costs, but the costs that communities face structurally as well. So, why is violence against animals addressed in GC 26? So, through the research, we were able to demonstrate that the concept of biophilia is inherently important in understanding the research findings. So, biophilia is essentially the tendency for all of us to connect emotionally to the natural world around us. So, this includes animals, nature, and it also includes the ability for us to recognize sentience. So, recognizing sentience means the ability to recognizing suffering in someone else. That requires empathy, both cognitive empathy and affective empathy. And what we know based on pre existing research is biophilia tends to be higher in children, at least at the very beginning, before they are enmeshed in the social norms of behavior. And we also know that when children are exposed to animal cruelty, there is a decrease in what we call emotional empathy slash affective empathy. And because of that, there's also then an increase in negative mental health symptomologies. So biophilia makes it more likely that when a child is exposed to animal cruelty, that for some of these kids, there will be a decrease in empathy. Now, for some children who have higher than average levels of empathy to begin with, that empathy doesn't necessarily go away, but it is somehow masked and I guess you could say not as apparent because of the additional traumatic symptoms those children would suffer, such as nightmares, depression, anxiety, emotional instability. Now, taking that link, we also know based on research that low empathy is linked with less support and dedication for climate change and sustainability initiatives. I mean, if you think of it from a very practical standpoint, for us to care about the world outside of ourselves, to us to care about future generations, that requires not just critical thinking, but the ability to empathize with a future generation, the ability to empathize with the world around us and care about these processes. So, if you have children who are exposed to violence, and the research shows it can reduce empathy, and empathy plays a foundational role in supporting these sustainable initiatives, well, there you have it. That's the link between childhood exposure to animal cruelty, adverse consequences, and the impact on the environment. And this is why the UN committee included this statement after we presented the research. We know, like I said earlier, we are not labeling any cultural or religious practices as inherently bad or good. Like I said, no country is immune from this. We do know based on the research findings that we have seen and what we have conducted that the exposure to what we call angry aggression, so that proactive violence against animals, is probably the most statistically significant predictor of commission of proactive violence. We also know that indirect and direct violence exposure are both harmful. So, what we mean by indirect exposure, it could be, for example, not actually seeing an animal being killed or physically injured, but hearing the sounds or seeing the aftermath, seeing the blood stains. I'm sorry to be graphic, but this is what we mean by indirect exposure, and we know both of them are harmful. And one area of research that has been neglected is the consequences for children who have been exposed to animal cruelty on a daily basis, what we call endemic animal cruelty. So, this would include acts such as the mass killing of dogs to try to control stray populations. All right, so with that said, this is the first study that my colleague Malcolm Plant presented. So he was working on this in 2016. It got published in 2019, and this is really what gained what caused us to pay even more attention to this problem. So he basically compared two different samples of youth, kids from Romania and then kids in Germany. And these kids ranged from the age of 13 to 17 years old. And so their goal here was to understand what are the most salient predictors of animal cruelty and of domestic violence, and what are the consequences for kids who are exposed to animal cruelty that happens in the cultural context. So at that time in Romania, there were many incidents of mass cullings of both cats and dogs, attempts to try to decrease rabies and control the free roaming population. And so kids were exposed to this almost on a daily basis. So they sampled children who were similar in many other ways, except for the areas in which they resided. And so, long story short, what they found was that animal abuse was statistically negatively associated with emotional empathy. So, what that means is as animal abuse increased, they saw a decrease in empathy, in emotional empathy. Okay. They also found that girls who were exposed to animal cruelty were less likely to commit animal cruelty. And that was because girls, on average, tend to have higher levels of emotional empathy over the life course. So we know that through our, I guess you could say, our biological research. When you measure empathy between, males and females, biological males and biological females. So that's the other big point. And then they also found this particular finding, which is probably the heart of the issue, that while witnessing animal cruelty predicted animal cruelty commission, it wasn't without consideration of the normalization of violence. So both kids in Germany and Romania who had witnessed animal abuse were more likely to engage in animal abuse. Okay. But in Romania, it was significantly more likely to happen. And they attributed it to the fact that those kids were exposed to it at higher levels and on a daily basis. And so they also link that back to that higher exposure to domestic violence. So this goes back to the domain one that I was discussing earlier, how domestic violence is definitely linked with animal cruelty perpetration. And so they concluded essentially that, before children inflict violence on animals, they're exposed to endemic animal cruelty and also human violence. And so this is really what inspired us to continue this research. And so me and my colleague Laura, in 2017, 2018, we began doing a systematic literature review. So we were trying to gather as many studies as we could that had examined the impact of some form of childhood exposure to animal cruelty. And by the time we had narrowed the studies down based on our methodological requirements, our sample size, all the data is here, but just for the sake of time and saving everyone the grief of having to go through all these findings, I'm going to summarize these key points. So we looked at three different outcomes. Any study that was a strong methodological study that looked at the impact of exposure to violence against animals on either internalizing symptoms in children, externalizing symptoms, which would be like aggression and bullying, or the outcome could have been violence against humans or animal cruelty. So if those studies met, we kept them. And so we had a total of 17 studies. And in short, 16 out of 17 of those studies found that there was a statistically significant link. Children who were exposed to animal cruelty in childhood were more likely to have all sorts of problems, including commission of human violence, either in childhood or in adulthood. So we found studies that were able to look at this link throughout that life course, which is really frightening, to be honest. And so you can see the breakdown of how many studies actually measured the outcome of these different areas that I mentioned and how many of them found statistically significant findings. And the one study that didn't find statistically significant findings, the authors and we also believe that it was due to a smaller sample size. I don't think any of us are really surprised. I mean, if you think about it, many of us advocates see cruelty day in and day out. Most of us tend to have at least average levels of empathy or higher, which means that even though our empathy isn't eroded, we tend to have a lot of these trauma symptoms. So imagine being a child who has no choice but to witness this day in and day out, whether it's in their home or whether it's in the context of a community setting where stray dogs are being butchered every day, or whether it's in the context of some sort of religious or cultural festival. Um, it all can exert its impact. I won't spend too much time here, but if anyone's interested, I'm happy to share this PowerPoint. These are just some of the mechanisms that explain why childhood exposure to violence against animals can result in commission of violence against both humans and animals. And this part, the prolonged grief symptomology. And I'm going to discuss that because this is what was really prevalent in many of the children that we have interviewed and talked to across the globe who have been exposed to this animal cruelty. So we have video footage and interview statements. And that's essentially what we shared with the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child. So I'm going to focus on this outcome, but if you are interested, these are just some of the different ways that all of these factors are linked, and this is the research evidence to support it. So we'll be focusing on this since that's what's reflected in the data. So when it comes to, how we know that children are harmed by this type of violence, well, it comes from our research, our extensive research showing the harms that children face when they're exposed to human violence. It is absolutely no different. And so the indirect violence exposure is harmful, okay? And I already explained what that is, and so is direct violence exposure. So indirect violence exposure could be not just seeing the aftermath, but also witnessing violent acts in the media. So one problem that me and my colleagues are starting to examine includes the consequences of a lot of the mass animal cruelty that circulates online and how that impacts the children who come across these videos. So what we know too now is that the impact of indirect and direct violence on on children during that developmental stage can lead to what's called prolonged grief symptomology. Prolonged grief symptomology happens when people have lost somebody they loved, somebody that they had a connection to, or somebody that they recognized sentience in and they grieved for them. And so post prolonged grief symptomology is very similar in some ways to post-traumatic stress disorder, but it's channeled even more so by a withdrawal from daily life and an attachment to a certain human, or in this case, a certain animal. All right. And what we know then, since the symptoms of animal cruelty exposure are very similar to the symptoms of children who are exposed to human violence, a lot of those neurological processes that happen in children who are exposed to human violence are the same things that are happening in kids who are exposed to violence against humans. So I'll sum it up here. Both direct and indirect exposure creates cascading pathways of cumulative neurophysiological processes. And these are what actually can result in additional adverse outcomes, such as empathy deficits, psychological problems, and yes, even physical health problems. And that's step 2 of the process. So before I explain this, remember when I said that there is a cost to violence exposure? We typically think of the mental health effects, the financial costs associated with developing security systems, court costs, policing costs. But what about physical health? Physical health is very much affected by exposure to violence. And this has been demonstrated very strongly since probably the mid 1990s and onward, but especially after a landmark study came out in 1998 showing that children with certain adverse experiences were more likely to have serious physical health problems in the long run. And those physical health problems could not be explained by behavioral choices. So, what is happening here? The chronic strain from exposure to violence against animals, leads our body to go into a fight or flight system. So, the fight or flight system essentially is your body's adrenal system activating in order to prepare itself for the danger that's coming. As a part of that process, the stress hormone cortisol increases. Cortisol is supposed to increase in response to stress, okay? But we're not designed to experience chronic stress like violence every day. And so, what happens in these kids who grow up in like abusive homes or they're seeing animal cruelty on a daily basis in some communities, that cortisol is high all the time. And when you have an increase in this cortisol, you now have an increase in inflammation throughout the body, and that just doesn't go away. That inflammation is then what leads to diseases like heart disease, diabetes, arthritis, and many more inflammatory processes. And this is not, this is not something that is assumed or something that is thought about. These types of processes have been demonstrated in multiple studies where they have actually used fMRIs to examine the brain of people who have been exposed to violence extensively. And so, what me and my colleagues recently proposed is that, along with the great list of what's called adverse childhood experiences, so that includes experiencing physical abuse, witnessing intimate partner violence, having an incarcerated parent, or having a parent with a serious mental illness, exposure to animal cruelty, especially when it happens on a daily basis in an endemic manner, is an adverse childhood experience. And that is what we have proposed in a new study that we conducted, and we will be publishing soon. So when you think about how you can explain this, like for other advocates who are interested in this, who want to fight animal cruelty, this is a really good way to present this to your policymakers. Because we know that even if policymakers don't care about children or they don't care about animals, they care about their pocketbooks. And when you think of these long term cumulative and cascading consequences that can happen, I mean, the financial cost is large, but like I said, the structural cost and the cost on humanity is even larger. So, this is just some of the case evidence. I can't share the actual recordings of the children because they have not been de-identified in terms of the audio. Before I go into this, some of these interviews were conducted in Morocco, some in Tunisia. There were other interviews we did in other parts of the country. Like I mentioned, we had studied children who had been exposed to animal cruelty in Romania and also in Germany. What we presented to the UN committee consisted of these video footage testimonies of children stating the impact that all this had on them, but also video footage of children being present when animals are being killed. And we had people like me who were trained in child safeguarding. So we were able to follow all the protocols that we needed to protect these children from further trauma. And so we presented all of the quantitative data that I just explained to you on the link, and we did this in a big report. We attached all of these statements. So there were many more statements, video footage, and I'll tell you what, the statistical evidence is very compelling. But what came out of the UN committee's members, what they said to us was the video footage is horrifying because we reminded them that, we have the option, those of us that are sitting here, if I put on a video of animals being killed and it's horrifying, we have the ability to turn away. We can turn it off. Children who live in these communities cannot. Children who are socially normalized into these processes are not able to simply turn away. And so what we found, there were some big themes that stood out with us. The vulnerable nature of the population. So some of the statements we got were from children who did not have a home. And this was actually representative of a few different children that we were able to interview. Many of these children had already experienced some sort of trauma in their life. And so for them, such as in this case, their dog Linda was basically a friend to them, a family member. And you can see from these quotes here that this is just some of the statements that they said. And then, of course, we received extensive video footage of animal cruelty, much of it with children present, and you can visibly see them experiencing the trauma. So it's very, very hard to watch. I haven't been doing as much on the ground animal rescue in the past probably 2 years. I still do things here to there. That's how I've ended up with my own dogs and animals. But seeing these video footages were very, very traumatizing. And I'll talk about that at the end of this presentation. The other thing was a prolonged grief symptomology. So, from some of the parents who were concerned about their children being exposed to that, they described that over time, these kids just appeared more sad. They had problems in school, they had trouble sleeping, and they just were not themselves anymore. I'm not showing any of these videos, but I want to give you an example that when we present to certain agencies, organizations, so I just presented at the Humane Canada Animal Cruelty Prosecution Conference. So I presented to police officers and prosecuting attorneys of animal cruelty crimes. These are some of the videos we would play for them. So we would play the videos that I just described so they could see firsthand what we are discussing. Now, what do we do with GC26? GC26 is not a magical end all for animal cruelty and child welfare. It is a tool. And one thing to keep in mind is that GC26 applies to all countries, which I believe it's 196 countries that have ratified the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child. Okay. The first thing we're trying to do is spread awareness among key leadership. So these would be people that are involved in public health, people who are involved in child safeguarding, and yes, veterinarians, other people who are involved in animal safeguarding. We want to inform them on the link, not just between childhood exposure to animal cruelty, but the general link on how animal welfare and child welfare are linked together. And like I said, until recently, the consequences of endemic and socially normalized animal cruelty has been neglected. Even now, when I look at it, there's only maybe 2 or 3 studies, including Malcolm's study, that has looked at the consequences of this endemic socially normalized violence. And most of it has focused on animal cruelty that occurs in the home, like in the context of domestic violence. The other thing that's a really big challenge to address, because everybody has their own belief systems and many of these practices, bring in big money. So it would be to address institutionalized violence. So animal violence in slaughterhouses, and certain cultural practices. We don't pick on any country because none of us, like I said, are immune to this problem. This is probably a really, really big challenge because sentience doesn't distinguish between a dog and a cow, or a dog and a pig, or a cat and a pig. It just doesn't. And so, whilst we acknowledge that certain practices can be carried out, I don't want to say humane, but in a more humane way where there's the least suffering to the animal, sure, that least suffering may cause less harm on the child. It's obviously harm to the animal, right? But in the context of what impacts the child, we have focused mainly on that proactive intentional violence because that's where the studies have been developing. So this is definitely a future area. The next area is really, some call them trap, neuter, vaccinate, and return. Others call it catch, neuter, vaccinate, and return. These are indeed the only scientifically proven way to have a long-term effect in decreasing populations of stray dogs and cats and even controlling rabies. And so this is why they're recommended by the World Animal Health Organization. And while it may seem like, okay, well, then these countries should just adopt these to control the stray populations, it's definitely not as simple as that. There's a lot of finances involved. And with one particular country that we have tried to implement these programs, there's a lot of pushback from leadership. And so it can be very, very challenging. The other thing that we have been doing, and it's a direct application of GC26, is training police and prosecutors on how to use GC26 to protect children and animals. So that could include things like looking at the age in which the child was exposed to the animal cruelty, the level of suffering the animal experienced, was the violence against the animal proactive or reactive? So these are the types of research and factors we present to key people involved. And if you're interested, these are just some of the other areas that I've been volunteering with the European Link Coalition. So recently, we were looking at many of the children who were exposed to mass killings of animals in Morocco and FIFA's endorsement of that. So we did meet with the FIFA Human Rights Committee, and that has been a long ongoing discussion fueled by much research, many statements from children, and a lot of video evidence. But time will tell where we will end up with that. So I won't spend too much time here, as I know time is limited. Um, so all of this, like many of you who are on the ground, this is traumatizing. We're sitting here talking about the trauma that children who witness this are exposed to. And I think one of the biggest impacts my work has had on me is this unresolved guilt that I'm not doing enough. And I don't even know if guilt's really the correct psychological terminology to use here. Because guilt sometimes is something you just feel internally, but this I feel this in my soul. I don't really have a scientific way of phrasing this. I feel it in my soul that what I do is not enough. It's never enough. And I know many of us here today feel that same way. So this has probably been the biggest challenge. As you can see, the work we've been doing, we don't get the benefit necessarily of always seeing that one animal that we have helped, because often animals are still dying, children are still being traumatized as we're trying to build this paradigm shift in animal advocacy. And it has been very, very challenging to do this because many times you do feel helpless and you do feel like there could be more that you're doing and your body simply won't let you. There are a lot of trauma symptoms. So this stems from my work with working with abused children and also with animals who have been violently killed. And some of the ways in which they were killed, it resonates with you such that when I go to, if you're cooking something on the stove and you accidentally touch yourself and you feel that jolt, it's painful. But the pain I would feel was not for me. It was for others who I had known had experienced that type of violence, that type of pain against them. And so it got pretty bad, and I'm not ashamed to say it's still happening, but I am working on it because I understand that if I can't care for myself, I will be of no use to those that have a voice, but whose voices are not heard. Depression, anxiety, it's all a part of it. I know every one of you here must know to some extent of what it feels like. And as I'm sitting here today and seeing all of these beautiful outpouring of love and support, it brings me to what I do to cope, interacting with other advocates, because I think when you feel like you're not making a difference, it really does take somebody on the outside to come in and say, no, 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 everything you're doing, it does matter. We're doing the same thing. And that solidarity is very, very important. And so even when I feel like shutting myself away from the world, I reach out to other people that I know who are probably doing a lot more than I'm doing. For example, there are animal advocates in Morocco and Azerbaijan and animal advocates in the farming industries who are trying to protect these animals. They're doing so much in defense of animals. And everybody is being exposed to this, some in more amounts than others. And so, sometimes in order to do the work, you do have to compartmentalize. And I found myself slowly, naturally having to do that, to be able to view the footage daily, just to be able to edit it or, explain to the policymaker what's happening here. You have to somehow compartmentalize it. Does that make me mentally resilient? I don't know. One thing that has not happened is it has not eroded my empathy. In fact, I feel more empathetic and I feel more inspired to keep doing this, especially when I see all the work that everybody else is doing around the globe. Um, so daily gratitude, of course, is something that I think we all can benefit from, reminding ourselves, why we're here on this great, big, wide earth, what we will actually regret when we're on our deathbed. What are those things? And then being really grateful for having that, making meaning out of everything. And of course, connecting with nature. That is my spot where I feel at one, and loving my animals, loving my husband, and then just speaking to you guys and getting that support. So, with that said, thank you very, very much. And thank you for having me here, Lisa and Marion in Defense of Animals. And thank you all to coming to this presentation that I must admit probably was a little choppy at times. I'm sleep deprived because part of the work I do sometimes requires me to be on meetings like at 2 in the morning or 3 in the morning. So I am a little bit sleep deprived. But thank you.
Wow. Well, thank you. This has been such an informative presentation, Roshni. We are so grateful to you for your work,
Oh, thank
and
you. Thank
we
you.
support what you're doing. It's making a huge difference in the world for animals and for children, and we are very grateful to you. We support you, and we also just extend our compassion to you for being part of that and experiencing some of the trauma from doing the work that you do, which is
Thank you.
so valuable and will make a big difference in
Thank you.
how animals are treated worldwide.
Thank you, Lisa. I firmly believe that it will be, even if it doesn't happen in my lifetime.
Mhm.
I think it will be. We are transitioning into that. You know, there's a lot of countries now that are developing animal cruelty laws. There's a lot more attention on this issue.
Yes, and
So
we
thank you.
at In Defense of Animals, we've been working with the advocates in Morocco. We've been doing some support groups with them and with animal advocates there, and also hosting a vigil for the dog
Yes.
that passed away. And
Yeah.
we're very um, and we have an alert to save the dogs in Morocco as well that's available on our website. And I believe that Mary has put it into the chat. So
That
we're
is wonderful.
working together. We're working together
Yeah.
to try to help the animals.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Their lives are not in vain. I just pray that their deaths are not in vain. That's the only thing I can hope for. You know, each of them, I think it's the ones that you don't know their names and you just you do wonder how people can do this to one another. And then you see that wonderful side of humanity where you have all of these activists who, no matter what they're going through, they never stop. Every day they're out there trying to save even that one animal that they can.
We are
And
truly grateful to the
well, thank
activists
you.
around the world and also those in
We
Morocco
are,
that we've been working directly
yeah,
with. There are
yeah,
our heroes and heroines, actually.
yeah, very much so. Thank you. And I did leave my email address on there and I can put it back here. If anybody has any questions, please do not hesitate to reach out to me. It's very informal on my end. So please just email me.
Thank you. And just curious if you might have another moment. Mary, do we have a question or two we could?
There's a lot of really great questions in here, and I also just want to echo what Lisa said. Your presentation skills are very good. You did a great job um, telling us all about it. It was fascinating and so inspiring. Thank you so much for everything you do and for being here today and talking with us about all your great work. But I do want to go into the questions that were asked.
Yes, there's
Um,
so many.
there's
I
like
think we'll
seven
probably
in the
have time
Q&A.
for just
So
maybe
let's
one
just
or
do a
two.
few,
Yeah.
right? Um, can you see the Q&A?
Um, why don't you share it because I think it'd be more helpful for
Okay.
Rush and
Okay.
also for other
So
people who are listening.
let's say there's so many. How did you work with your city and the police to turn their pound into a well-working shelter? This person says, I am trying to turn my city pound into a working shelter. This might be a complicated question.
And I'm really, really sad to say, at while I was there, we had made some headway into where some of us animal advocates were allowed into the pound to pull animals out that we thought would have a good chance at getting a home. It never officially turned into a full shelter. And I left that area back in 2018 or 2019 and everything just became a little bit stagnant. I will be honest. I think there's, there's some challenges with the agency management and people that work with each other. And so, honestly, I did what I could while I was living there, and there have been still some efforts since then. I think we got it. I guess you could say on a scale of 1 to 10, if it was at a 0 in terms of being able to save the animals, we got it to like a 3. And there's still so much more to do. And I'm really hoping that the rest of the volunteers in Gadsden County Humane Society will do that. We did get a lot of support eventually from the sheriff's office. So there were some deputies who were very passionate animal lovers and just recognizing that something needed to be done. So we did have people we could call out to help with certain cruelty cases. But there's no cookie cutter answer to that because there's still not a full-fledged shelter. It's taken a lot of time. And that might be one of my deepest regrets, that if I could have just gone back there, and I've reached out to them a few times offering my services, but nothing so far. We did make a change though. It is, from what I know, unless things took a backward trend, it did improve somewhat in terms of how many animals we could get out of there.
Thank you, Roshni. Mary, would you like to maybe do one or two more questions? And we will, for those people who registered, we will be sending an email to you with the replay link, and it will also have some resources for you that Roshni will share with us to help, and also ways to connect.
And I'm happy to share the actual PowerPoint presentation too. That is perfectly fine.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Roshni. It'd be great if you happen to have a link of it somewhere. That would be super helpful.
Can I email it to you perhaps? If I can email you the PowerPoint, I don't have a link to it.
Okay. All right. Yeah. Mary, any other question we want to? You might need to unmute though.
I forgot I muted. There are a lot of great questions, but this one I think is particularly poignant. It wasn't mentioned, but we're curious if kids around hunting for either food or trophies are affected by lack of empathy.
That's a very, very important question. So it's really, really challenging because the research findings, what they have done so far in terms of the individual level animal cruelty research, it has distinguished between the impacts of, I guess you could say, like what we call a quick kill or killing for the purpose of food versus somebody hurting an animal out of anger or hurting them to inflict pain. Most of the animal cruelty research has focused on the latter. There's really not any studies, to my knowledge, at least not any peer-reviewed studies, that have looked at the impact of hunting practices on children in empathy. And I do think, without stepping on any toes, there's probably a context in which obviously the animal suffers significantly, but is there a difference on the impact to the child if they see a humane killing happening, let's say on a deer, and they see that the deer is quickly killed? The father explains it was for food. Thank the animal. You now have food. Be mindful of what you've gotten. Versus a child who's being exposed to a dog being beaten to death because the dog was considered a nuisance, right? So there probably is differences in terms of the impact on what it has on a child. And I think one way of looking at this is to put yourself in the situation and said, if you had to be exposed to one of these today, in the next 10 minutes, what do you think would traumatize you the most? And I think if you can look at it that way, we do come to some sort of consensus in the research, at least, saying that certain types of killings are going to be more harmful to the children. They're obviously harmful to the animals, but we also have something like humane euthanasia, right? So the goal is to minimize suffering, not to inflict it. So if an animal is being killed, is there attention paid to the minimization of that suffering? But I wish I could say that concretely we know more. And that's what we have put the plea out to other researchers, that we can't do this alone. Let's start studying these, start studying the impact of just any type of killing of animals, and like I said, we're not trying to step on any toes. There are like ethical, humane hunters, and then you have people who don't hunt, right? But then they'll eat we eat or people eat factory farmed meat, right? Where there is animal cruelty happening. So it's so hard to make these judgments or give these blanket statements because we simply don't have concrete research on the impact of
I
such
do want to
accidents.
I do want to tell you about my professor at Canisius College, Joshua
Yeah.
Russell. He actually did a piece on the effects on children when taken out hunting, like for the first time, and
Oh,
interviewed
wow.
them and got kind of their reactions to things. Very
Yeah.
interesting piece. I can send you his
I would
LinkedIn.
love to see that because we've been
Yeah,
looking for something like that for a long, long
yeah.
time.
I
Has
would
he
love to send it
published
to you.
it? Yeah, has he
I think he
published it
has.
yet?
Yeah,
He
I
has?
read it.
Okay, okay. Okay.
So
Yeah, we
send it to
definitely
you.
would like to look at that. Please
Additional.
do.
Will
No,
do.
please do.
Okay.
Yeah, it's hard to find all the studies when we're going through the review process.
Yeah,
So we definitely want to see that.
great. I'm glad I
Yeah,
can spread his work.
please
Really
do
good.
that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you everyone for being here. We're already
Yeah.
very past time.
Yes,
And
yes.
I'm seeing all of these, just these comments on here. Thank you. And people working on child abuse, please. I can't see all these, and I want to respond to each of these people. I want to respond to each of you, but I can't at this moment because I know we're running out of time. But please email me this information, and nothing actually is off topic here. This is all connected. So
So for
yeah,
anyone
thank
who's
you.
with us watching, on a different platform, just want to say we've got some incredible questions, and what we'll do is we will send you, Roshni, the chat box, so you'll be able to see that, and then
Oh,
perhaps
perfect.
we can then address some of the questions in the resources that we send to everyone.
Wonderful.
Then they
Okay.
can also reach
Okay.
out to you directly. So hopefully we'll get to answer all your questions, even if we don't get to do that right in this very
Okay.
moment. So
Perfect.
thank you all so much for taking the time to
Thank you.
in to this special program for Activist Appreciation Month. We wanted to give you this research to help you in your activism. And we deeply appreciate, Roshni, your delivery of the material and your work in this field. It is groundbreaking, and it will heal hearts and minds. And I do believe it will make big
Thank you.
changes for animals around the
Thank
world.
you. Well, I'm here, Lisa, and I'm not leaving your guys' side. So
Oh,
thank you for
oh,
everything you guys have done. And like I said, I will email you my PowerPoint and I will be checking my emails. I'm really open to learning. If you have any information that you think will help me to keep doing my job, please let me know. And on behalf of every single one of you here, thank you for everything you are doing. Thank you so much.
yes, we appreciate all of you. That is the whole purpose of our
Yeah,
Activist Appreciation
thank
Month.
you.
And so this was such a wonderful example of that in action. So
Yeah,
thanks to each of you, and to Roshni and to Mary for this event. And we will send the replay, and it will also be posted on In Defense of Animals YouTube channel as well. So it will be there in perpetuity.
wonderful.
You all so much. I hope that this helps to be a resource for you for healing and also for your advocacy. And we appreciate all of you. Have a wonderful day, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Nice.
Thank you.